Good morning, everyone, and welcome to my first Facebook Live. We had some technical difficulties last week, so here we are again this week. I want to say hello. My name is Dr. Jennifer Levin. I am the founder of From Grief to Growth. I'm also the host of the podcast Untethered, Healing the Pain from a Sudden Death. And I am the creator of the course Healing After a Sudden and Traumatic Loss. I also want to thank those of you who are watching the replay of this podcast, or excuse me, I want to thank those of you who are watching the replay of this Facebook Live. I'm tuning in today from Whidbey Island in Coopville, Washington, and I'm really curious where you're watching today. So I'd love for you to put a comment in the post and let me know where you're joining and watching me from. So, today we're going to be talking about some of the differences, and I'm actually going to highlight five of the differences between a sudden and unexpected loss and an expected loss, or what we call an anticipated loss. But I want to spend a minute and talk about a few things first. And one of the things that I want to talk about is actually what is a sudden loss? And it may sound obvious because a sudden loss is something that happens when we don't expect it. We go along and bam, something happens and our loved one is taken from us without warning. And this happens most often in the case of, let's say, an accident, a medical crisis, God forbid, a suicide, a homicide. It could be something like a natural disaster. If our loved one's overseas and they're fighting in a war, anything that happens when we weren't expecting it. Most of the time, we get a phone call. We may come home or come to an event and even find our loved one, which can be very, very difficult and even impact the way that we recover and grieve from the loss. And let's compare this or talk about how this differs from when a loved one has cancer and we have an opportunity to anticipate that the loss is coming along, or they have a medical illness that's degenerative in nature, such as a heart condition, COPD, or chronic heart failure. And even in those cases, we don't actually know when the loss is going to occur or death is going to occur. We never really do, but we have an idea that it's going to be happening and it's going to happen sometime soon, and that gives us an opportunity to prepare for the fact that someone we love is going to die, and that we have a chance to have some of those important conversations. And so we're going to talk about the differences that occur when we know that someone is going to be dying versus what happens when we get absolutely no warning whatsoever. So I just kind of wanted to talk about or just mention that the different ways that people die when the different ways that people die when a loss occurs suddenly versus when it's expected or that it's anticipated. So let's just get that out in the open first. So I'm also curious to know what are some of the sudden losses that you have experienced, and that would be helpful for me to be able to comment on those as well. I mentioned I am new to this, so I'm going to see if I can see these in the comments so that I can mention them as I go along. I'm not seeing, I do see a comment here, so let me see if I can do this, and if I don't get to it this time, then uh, I will mention it in the next one as well. So let's turn to it, but let's turn to some of the differences that actually are at play when somebody dies in a sudden manner versus an expected manner. So, the first I want to mention is that when it's unexpected, there's no opportunity to say goodbye. There's no opportunity to plan. Life actually stops in its track and everything changes. Things are left undone. And things that you would have planned for, things that you would have said, things that you would have thought about, things that you would have done, didn't get a chance to happen. All of a sudden, like I said, you come home, you get the phone call, and everything stops and your life totally pivots. Most people would say explodes. Most people would say changes on a dime, and and just everything stops. And that's the biggest change that happens when there's a sudden loss. And one day you think you're going along, and then bam, everything changes in a flash, and then you're left picking up these unbelievable pieces. You're left with a total loss and pain, and in many cases trauma, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Number two, and my next podcast, which takes place next Wednesday at this time, talks about the feelings of vulnerability. You learn that if something can happen unexpectedly at any time, that you're vulnerable. All of a sudden, life can throw something at you unexpectedly, and someone you love can be hurt and taken from you. And if this can happen now, it can happen to anyone that you love at any moment, at any time. And there's this sense that perhaps the world is no longer the safe place that you thought it once was. And this is a huge almost burden to live with. And so this sense of vulnerability takes over life for many people. It can result in anxiety. It can result in the way changes in the way you live your life. I've had many people decide that they're going to stop driving or they're not comfortable leaving the house for a while. The good news is that it's often very, very temporary until you find a way to make your world feel safe again. It's something that's very normal, or I should say, a normal reaction to a very, very abnormal event that you've just experienced. But it is something that often occurs with a sudden and a traumatic loss. The third thing that many people experienced is so many unanswered questions. When there's a sudden or a traumatic death that has occurred, like I said, it's just happened without warning. And you don't understand, especially initially, what's happened. Your mind goes into overdrive with all of these questions of, well, what do you mean this happened? And how could this happen? And this didn't make any sense. And could I have done anything differently? And could it have been prevented? And all of these things just start flooding you and keeping you up at night. And you just, like I said, I can't even emphasize the word flooding with questions and the overdrive of the uncertainty that you begin to live with because of all of the unanswered questions and living in the unknown of what really happened. And for some people, this isn't as much of an issue as it is for other people. But it can really complicate the grieving process. And so, this experience of unanswered questions, and for many, there's feelings of guilt and regret, should haves and could haves and would haves that even accompany these unanswered questions. And this is something that I explore with people, individuals who are living with a sudden and unexpected death that accompanies the grieving process. Um, The next thing I want to mention is that for many people, there is a feeling that a sudden and unexpected death could have been preventable. Now, again, this doesn't apply to everybody, but for a significant percentage of people, there is a feeling that the loss could have been preventable. And this is really difficult to live with. And what if I had done something different, or if this set of circumstances had played out differently? And again, this is another factor that can really complicate the grieving process. So, we'll be talking a lot more about that for those of you who choose to either follow my podcast or stay with me through some of these Facebook Lives. But I did want to mention that this feeling that perhaps what happened could have been preventable is something that can also complicate the grieving process. And then the final thing that I do want to mention today, that's maybe one of the biggest thing, is a sudden and unexpected loss can be very, very traumatic. And by traumatic, I mean that um, something traumatic was done to the body of your loved one, and either in the way that they died or in the manner in which they tried to save your loved one. And this can be very difficult for you as the survivor, especially if it's something that you witnessed or saw. And, if there was an accident and you felt your loved one suffered, this is very hard to live with. And a lot of times in resuscitation efforts, it's very difficult to see or to know what was done to your loved one's body as well. And so, um, by trauma, I also mean these are some of the experiences that you may be living with right now. So perhaps you're ruminating, and by that I mean you are reliving a lot of you are reliving or replaying, I should say, a lot of the scenes or the details of what happened the day of the event that your loved one died. So at night, you're lying in bed and over again, you're replaying what happened. That's what we mean by rumination. Or you are having a lot of anxiety thinking about what happened. You're experiencing hypervigilance. You're constantly on alert thinking about what happened or waiting for the other shoe to drop. Perhaps you're living in what we call fight or flight. You probably heard that back in the caveman time when, our ancestors were constantly running from tigers or getting ready to fight them. Well, those are things called the fight or flight syndrome. And those are trauma symptoms where we experience them when our body's on constant alert. And those are things that we can experience after a loved one has died in a traumatic manner. And that is something that can be very difficult to live with after a traumatic loss and make your loss, or I should say, your grieving experience even more difficult for you. And more often, or I shouldn't say more often, but many times the trauma experiences that you are living with after a loss can make it difficult for you to even get in touch with your grief because the experiences of the trauma are overshadowing early on. It won't always be that way, but early on you may be experiencing some of the trauma of what it's like to have watched a loved one experience a sudden loss, and that can be really hard. So I know I threw a lot at you today about some of the differences about losing a loved one in a sudden manner versus an expected loss. But over time, some of these, or most of these symptoms, I should say, do dissipate. During the podcast, I go over the during my podcast, Untethered, dealing with a sudden loss. We go over some of the techniques that you use, some of the Facebook Live techniques. I'm going to come on or I'm going to give you some ways to help regulate your emotions, to practice tips and help yourself calm down or regulate your emotions, and provide you with new ways to deal with some of these difficult emotions that you're dealing with after losing a loved one in a difficult manner. I also have a free mini course that I want to encourage you to sign up for. Please visit my website, fromgrieftogrowth.com, to sign up for my free mini course, 3 Truths for Living with a Sudden and Unexpected Loss. I invite you to subscribe to my podcast, Untethered, Healing from a Sudden Death. And our next podcast will be on Wednesday, May 25th. You can sign up for the podcast on Apple Podcast and Spotify. And the next one will be called My Entire World Turned to Chaos, and we'll be going over the theory of shattered assumptions. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. I wish you a great week, and bye for now. Take care of yourself.